thing. I think you're more likely to get that between a coalition of the religious and the Petersonian approach to society.
And the libertarians.
I think
because the libertarians would want a return to federalism, which is what you're advocating.
Yeah, the libertarian will again, I think they're influential within that coalition. And then when it comes to the kind of what he describes again as the red pill, that's the one where I think they just need to be able to. I think they can coalesce around kind of that Peterson approach of like you're now going to have a society where the things that were pissing you off and making you angry are not there anymore, or certainly not the threat that they currently are that you perceive them to be. And then secondly, you do have something to work for, because there's still the concept of self-improvement, there's still the concept of building your family, building a business, building whatever it is. You have the ability to engage, you have the ability to take that competitive nature, the aggressive aspects of masculinity, and now push those toward a productive outcome instead of a destructive one. And so that's what I'm hoping for in the coalition. But I do think when it comes to young men, and I know some people have gotten mad at me at some of the things where you've gotten mad at me before because you feel like I'm trashing men too. And please understand, when I'm critical of some of the decisions that men have made in general within society, or the way that they even view society right now, I'm not being critical of masculinity, and I'm not being critical of all men in general. What I am saying is that I don't see any way out of our situation by telling men, you're right, none of it's your fault, and none of it, it all just sucks, burn it down.
It's these 304s, man.
It's like, I said, my argument is going to be, strong men make good societies. So go be a strong man. And the response I get back is, you don't understand what it's like today. Maybe not to be at your age today, but I do know this. Strong men, strong, honorable men create good societies. And there's no other substitute. And it sucks. It sucks that you've got to be honorable and strong in a situation, in a civilization, in an environment that is repeatedly hammering you for it and trying to shame you for it and trying to guilt you for it. And the only thing I can say is, you got to do it anyways. You got to do it anyways, because your children and your grandchildren are depending on you to do it.
Yeah, but
and so I'm not denigrating. I am not denigrating how difficult it is. I really am not. I'm just saying, brother, there's no alternative.
We don't have another option. Now allow me to present the bear case scenario.
Yeah.
Nick, I really appreciate what you have to say in the fact that you are advocating for that stuff. Even though I remember I got into that fight with you. It was immediately after a podcast. It was after the podcast where we decided to turn it into a series on dating and relationships last year. But like, I don't believe that's going to happen, because you said right there that you've got to do this because your children and grandchildren are depending on you. These people don't have children and grandchildren. They've got nothing to lose. I have nothing to lose. I'm 29. I haven't had a stable relationship probably since I left high school, entered college. And there's no sign that there's ever going to be one, to be completely honest. But here's the thing. I'm not saying this like, woe is me, I'm a victim. I'm saying this like, this is the reality. I've come to accept it. Quite frankly, I don't think I care anymore. Shame on, their loss. I ended up being relatively successful in what I did. And now I look at it where it's like, okay, I've got the financial resources and the experience, and I'm older and more mature now. If it weren't for my height, I probably could find somebody. But I don't actually really think I want to anymore. Because the way that the system is currently built, what exactly do I get out of it? I get to, marry somebody that slept around with 20 other guys, and then they could divorce me and take half my stuff? I worked really hard for my stuff. What did they do? Nothing? Because it's my generation I'm speaking about. It's not like I'm speaking about these young whippersnappers. I'm talking about 20-something-year-olds like myself that I grew up with, that I went to high school with and college with. I know what my generation has produced in terms of women, and they're pretty trash. I also know what they produce in terms of men, and they're also pretty trash too. But the ones that are pretty trash in terms of men, they have gotten to a point where, I'm telling you that the dark side of the right emerging is absolutely terrifies me, because I see it happening, and it's not going to happen yet. It's going to take maybe 10 or 20 years, but it will happen. I'm terrified that it's going to happen, Because as I said earlier, the system will eventually collapse. The dollar will eventually collapse. There's no appetite to cut spending or balance budgets in D.C. And when they flip on the money printers again next time, F.A. Hayek's Road to Serfdom will be complete at that point. And when that happens, there will be a power vacuum because the federal government will be so inept and incompetent, it will not be able to hold on to control. And at that point, the dark side of the right, I really do see. I really see that they're gonna win out. And it's crazy because when I first got into politics, I was convinced that it was the left that was going to take over and force us into 1984, right? I said earlier it was the Democratic Socialists were going to keep getting elected. They were going to be able to implement their policies with only token opposition from the right because politics and demographics moved in their direction. And then when their policies failed to achieve what they promised that they would deliver, they would abandon the democracy side before they would abandon the socialism side. That's what I thought was going to happen. I believed that from 2008 to, say, 2012. And now I've gotten older and I've come to believe that that's not going to happen. What's going to happen is the left will keep winning election after election until the system breaks. And when the system breaks, they will not be the ones that will seize power. It's going to be the right that seizes power. And it's not going to be a return to federalism and constitutional government. It's going to be authoritarian right wing. It's going to be, for once, the left will actually be right when they say it's fascism. And you know what? I don't agree with it, but I understand it. And I will understand why it will happen. I'm not going to necessarily be marching with the guys when they go seize power.
Yeah.
I'm not going to be one of the Boogaloo Boys, right? But like, I not that I think that they're going to be the ones to do it, but you get my point that like.
Yeah. It's one of those things, you don't like it, you don't want it to happen, but you understand.
I understand why it's happening.
You understand how it could. Well, and this is where...
And it terrifies me because, like, I think the left is going to supply... I said this earlier in this episode. I think the left is going to supply the rope that will be used to hang themselves. They will win election after election until they break the system that they also said was oppressive and you know, filled with power structures that discriminated against marginalized communities, whatever. They control all the institutions in this country. But you know what? They won't control them forever because when they break the system, and they will break the system at D.C., we all know at this table that what is currently going on in D.C. is unsustainable. One day the system will fall apart. And when that system falls apart, what replaces it is not going to be left-wing utopianism, and it's not going to be right-wing constitutional government. It's going to be right-wing authoritarianism that replaces it. It will not be a return to James Madison. It will be a return to Caesar.
So, Christian, I'm curious because obviously I'm still single and have not found my wife yet, but I'm also not as cynical towards the possibility of finding that woman within the next few years. What do you think about our situations have led us to different conclusions here about the possibility of that happening?
Oh, man, that's a difficult question. I had something that I wanted to say earlier, or like when I was listening to you, but I don't want to say it because it's going to sound insulting, and I don't mean it. The audience doesn't know me as well as you two do.
Yeah.
Nick and Hamilton, I've known Nick for almost a dozen years now. Yeah. And I've known Hamilton for, 3 or 4 years now?
4 years, yeah.
They both know that, like, I say things that can come across as, like, really mean or offensive. No, seriously, but
yeah,
I don't, deep down inside, I'm not actually trying to, like,
You're
belittle
blunt,
somebody.
not cruel.
I'm blunt, but not cruel. I'm very
Right.
blunt, but I value your guys' friendship tremendously. That's why I'm on this podcast 2 days a week. But, like, I think that part of the reason is that, like, I spend a lot of my spare time. Hamilton, you spend a lot of your spare time, like, trying to, like, harvest new skills, to be a better producer, to do a better job running this show,
Right.
to like, obtain technical skills. I spend a lot of my free time in like, philosophy. I read a lot of history. I read a lot of philosophy. I read a lot of what people say on the internet.
Yeah.
And what people say before there even was an internet. And I've just been convinced through all of my reading and research. I am an academic-oriented person. I wanted to be a college professor when I was younger. I'm just convinced the stuff that I read and see, not just recent, but even older, but especially recent stuff, that the backlash that is going to be coming is going to be fascist in nature. It's not going to be a return to federalism. and I think it's going to be. I'm going to say
So
something
what-
that's going to be very dangerous, but I think it's going to be driven by people like me.
I-
And that
I don't-
terrifies me. Here's what I mean by that. Just listen to what I say. Jordan Peterson gets a lot of flack for this, but he's 100% right when he says that the worst atrocities that have ever been committed have been committed by ordinary men. In fact, there's a book called this, and the book is about how the milkman in Germany ended up joining the SS.
Some group, yeah.
And Peterson, he says that this is an extremely important thing.
Yeah.
The left denies this, and when anybody brings it up, they then accuse you of being evil. But it's actually the opposite. Peterson says, in one of his biblical series lectures, he says, there's a piece of Cain in you, no matter how able you think you are. And when you recognize that, and you accept that there's a piece of Cain in you, and we as Christians believe that, at least I'd like to believe that we believe that. Maybe we only say it and we don't actually believe it, but you should believe it. You are capable of tremendous evil. Even if you think you're a good person, even if you think you have good intentions, it's when you recognize that you are capable of tremendous evil that you can restrain yourself and prevent yourself from actually committing the evil that you are capable of. And so that's why I say that I think this dark side of the right is going to be driven by people like me, because I think it's true. And I'm saying this because I don't want to be part of it.
Yeah.
But I'm scared that people like me will be. And I'm convinced that people like me will be. I don't want to be a part of it. I want no part of authoritarianism. I want to live my life in peace. I want to marry somebody and raise a family and be a good husband and father and be a successful entrepreneur and businessman and have a legacy to hand on to my children. I want to be able to, I've told you my dreams. I want to be able to buy a Victorian house, a Victorian mansion, and refurbish it and restore its history because I love history so much. I have very simple goals in life. I don't want to, but I'll end with this because I want to hear what you have to say. But I'm absolutely terrified that people like me, and hopefully not me, but people like me, are going to be the ones that are going to usher in the death of the American Republic because the left poured the gasoline on the floor, lit the match, and handed it to people like myself. And then they dropped it and started the fire. And that's the direction that I see things going. I'll leave it to you.
You know, it's been really interesting to watch some of my acquaintances and friends go from high school age to graduating college to having a career and see their interests in life adjust as they get older and they experience more things. And to me, it only makes sense that there would be a backlash amongst conservative men if those men feel like, one, they have no purpose, and two, that the purpose that they wish they had been taken from them or removed, the possibility of that purpose being removed. And I personally, amongst my friend groups and the people that I know, I just see more and more men realizing that being a dad and having a family is a good thing and is worth pursuing and is worth putting effort towards. And yeah, the dating market may not be encouraging, and there may not be a lot of women that that I would want to marry, but I think over the past few weeks I've been talking to a lot of different people, and I think women that are in the dating market have the same problem of not being able to find men that they want to build a family with. And so I think that I guess I'm just not as convinced that there's a backlash that is going to happen. And what I'm going to ask you now is convince me that it's going to happen.
Oh, with enough chaos? With enough,
it's already happening.
Yeah, with enough. Look, to the degree that again, Christian is more. He thinks it's inevitable. I think that there's still corrections that can be taken that will blunt what will happen. Like I think Christian thinks it's just going to collapse. I think we can have a little bit smoother landing than splat, right?
Yeah.
But there's no question. There's no question that there's certain things that have been put in place just economically, fiscally, at the same time that some of these other things are happening to social structures within the United States that are generally important to maintaining order. But if you get into a place where you start to get into hyperinflation, if you get into and you don't have other structures which are able to guard against the sort of things that happen with economic collapse, then you're in for some really, really rough times. That's just inevitable. I'm sorry, history shows us that too many times, and we have done too many things fiscally, and especially monetarily at this point, to not avoid something significant. And the problem is that if you do those things in a society where there's still a strong family structure and there's still a strong religious institutions and other social institutions that provide glue within society, you can navigate those a lot easier. But if you're just going for like total full-on hedonism, like if it feels good, do it, and I identify as anything I want, and I can make whatever decisions I want, and somebody else is obligated to pay for it or do it because you're an oppressor and I'm not. And you know who said this best was actually Joel Salatin.
What did he say?
Joel Salatin, who's a farmer, really interesting guy, just great guy, great family. They have polyface farms up in the valley in Virginia. And he was talking about when he lived in Venezuela and the coup took place. And he said, when you have a breakdown in the various political and legal and social structures within a society, regardless of what the motivations of the people engaging in the rebellion of the coup or whatnot, it ends up being an opportunity for people to settle old scores against everyone else. And so now that person you didn't like, that person you had a grudge against, that person you were angry with, there's nobody there to stop you from doing something to them now. And he described it as, he goes, the machine guns came in the front door and we ran out the back. And that was it. And we lost everything we had down there. And I think that's part of what Christian's talking about. It's this, we have sometimes this idea of how things are going to manifest itself or how people will act in that environment. We assume, because we've never experienced it, we assume that, of course people won't, engage in looting and violence. And more, I got to look at someone when they say that and be like, really? Really? And why do you think this? Because you haven't experienced it? Okay, well, you're going to have to do a little bit more understanding of history to recognize that it's entirely possible. What Christian said is that what people are capable of justifying in crisis is interesting enough. But what people are able to justify when they're angry and they feel genuine resentment and it's revenge time, that is also shocking.
The German people felt resentment towards the Treaty of Versailles, and look at what happened next.
Well, and even
that's an extreme example, but it's one worth bringing up.
even when you look at groups like because again the question is, and Peterson devoted so much time to this, is try to understand how do regular people engage in atrocities like this and then go home and kiss their children. Like that's the part. It's so difficult to grasp your mind around. Yeah. How does someone go out, line up a bunch of innocent people, strip them down naked, shoot them in the back of the head, push them in the pit, and then go home and read their kid a bedtime story? Right? It's if you're not aware of the amount of evil that you're capable of, you'll never be able to develop the character, the strength, and whatnot to be able to combat it when it becomes tempting to use it. And again, this is the part where I think to Christian's point, it's easy to develop a society of men that are willing to keep the evil at bay
when they have something worth fighting
when they're
for.
When they're standing in front of something that they love and they're willing to die for. Like there was only one time in Iraq, 2 combat tours, I don't know how many ambushes, how many raids, how many missions I went on. There was only one time where I really thought I might not make it out of this. And I had a decision to make at that point, and I could remember something my father said to me. I can remember something that I felt obligated, not just all my family, but specifically my son. And it was, if I don't do what I'm supposed to do right now, and I survive, I'll have to explain to my son at one point, or I will live in the knowledge that everything I tell my son to do with respect to honor and integrity and sacrifice will have meant nothing because when it was my turn, I didn't do it. And I remember vividly thinking in that moment, I got to do this and come what may. Like I've got to do it. I have to do it, and it has to be me. There's no other way. I have to do it. And thank God. I'm happy to be sitting here and not at Arlington. But it was easy to have all those things flash through my mind because I had a wife, because I had daughters, because I had a son, and the only thing that I can give to that, and the only thing that I can give in response to all of this is this, and this is why, before anything else, my faith is paramount. In Philippians, Paul talks about the peace that surpasses all understanding. He doesn't talk about the peace, which is easily recognizable because everything is wonderful and great. And again, peace in the midst of prosperity and security and wealth and abundance is obvious. It's understandable, even though it doesn't always materialize that way. It's the peace that surpasses all understanding. And the reason why I do believe that my faith provides that underlying foundation for everything else with respect to my worldview is because I do believe that there is a God. I do believe that there is a moral lawgiver. I do believe that there is a purpose. I do believe that this isn't all just some experiment. And I do believe I have an obligation to live honorably. And I do believe that there is something in that if tomorrow I didn't have my wife and I didn't have my kids and I didn't have all the things right now that compel me to get up and to be better, there would always be that. There would always be that. It can't be taken away. It absolutely cannot be taken away. It is not subject to what the culture tells me. It is not subject to what the government tells me. It's not subject to what popularity tells me. And it's not subject to what fear would potentially attempt to drive me to do. None of it. And it becomes something. It's not a crutch. I believe it to be true. If it were a crutch, it would be faddish. It wouldn't matter. But because I believe it to be true, and because I think it honestly is true, that no matter what happens within the storm, I know what my mission is.
There's a donation from Thumper who said, thank you for the donation, by the way. He said, Christian, your concerns are why you have to be involved, so you can prevent it from going that direction. We need a return to the founder's vision. We can't sit back and hope. We gotta act. I completely agree. I want the positive outcome. I'm just terrified that it's not going to happen. And I've been fighting my whole life before I was even legally eligible to vote. Yeah. Nick knows this. Nick has known me since before I was even 18. I've devoted my whole life to this.
Fighting.
I said earlier, like, I wanted to be a college professor when I was younger. I did until I met Nick. That's the reason I'm at this table. My plan was to go to school, get a PhD, and teach at a university somewhere and teach history. And I met Nick, and I decided this guy gets it, and he's worth pushing to give him a bigger platform so he can convince more people of our shared values. And I decided to put my entire life on hold, change the course of my career, trajectory, and go into politics to help Nick get that bigger platform.
Well, dang, no pressure. Thanks.
I've been with him on and off ever since. But like, yeah. Hamilton, you asked me earlier. Yeah. Explain to me why, you're so pessimistic. There's two components to it, and Nick did kind of hint at it. The first one is, and I think we can all agree on the first one. The first one is the system will collapse in this. I don't mean Mad Max. I mean the dollar system will collapse eventually because when's the federal government ever going to balance its budget? It's not going to happen. It's only a matter of time until that happens. We've been speculating for decades, but eventually it has a 100% track record of fiat currency systems collapsing. 100% track record. So that will happen. We all know that will happen. That's why we are fiscal conservatives, because we know Keynesian economics does not work. Money printing does not work. If we know that hyperinflation will eventually destroy the dollar and thus destroy the power of the federal government, that leads to the second point that I have of why I'm so pessimistic. If the system collapses, if the federal government no longer has the power of the purse at its beck and call in order to coerce states and localities to do what they want to do, what exactly prevents them from being replaced by a more authoritarian system spearheaded by people on the right? And if you want proof of this, we've seen it happen. We have all been on the libertarian side of the Republican Party, the more liberty-oriented side of the party. When have we ever won anything? The libertarian moment came and went. 100 years. No, seriously. You know I'm right. You guys know that I'm right. The libertarian moment came and went. Ron Paul didn't get the nomination, Mitt Romney did. So we had and not that he's the authoritarian guy, he's the loser establishment guy. Those guys are being replaced by the Trump wing of the party. When 2016 happened, it wasn't Jeb Bush that got the nomination, so it wasn't business as usual. It wasn't the controlled opposition people that won, and it wasn't the libertarian people that won. It wasn't Rand Paul that won. It wasn't even Ted Cruz that won. Not that he's really a libertarian guy, but he tried to play off of that system. It wasn't either of those two people that got it. It was Donald Trump that got the nomination. And Donald Trump got the nomination, why? Not because he had any conservative credentials. The guy was a Democrat 5 minutes before he ran for president. It wasn't because he had any conservative policies. I remember he was bumbling over himself talking about how the government's going to pay for people's health care in the middle of a Republican primary. He got the nomination because he said what people on the right had been wanting politicians to say for a very long time. He went to the cathedral, he went to the Leviathan, he pointed his finger at it, he pointed his middle finger at it, and he said, F all of you, we're going to seize power, and we're going to do things our way. And the people cheered him for it. And they lined up in droves and voted him into office. And then they learned, after 4 years, that he couldn't achieve everything because the Leviathan is still in charge in D.C. The cathedral is still in charge. Most of these institutions are still dominated by the left. The president, even if he has an R next to his name, even if he's Donald Trump, can only achieve 1% of what somebody like FDR was able to achieve. And so, when the system collapses, because it will eventually, because we have endless money printing and endless growing deficits, and those will only eventually be able to be filled through debt monetization, which again, we're all on the same page, that will lead to catastrophe. When that system collapses, the thing that will replace it will be a more competent, more ruthless, more authoritarian equivalent of Donald Trump, who will tear the Leviathan to pieces. He will dismantle the cathedral. And when that happens, the only way that it will be achieved is through authoritarianism. Progressivism will be smited, but unfortunately it will not be smited through a return to constitutional government. It will be smited by handing power over to Caesar.
I disagree. No, listen, that was incredibly passionate, well thought out, well delivered. I just don't agree. I don't agree that it has to be that way. I don't agree that it has to be that way, but I will say this. It's one of those things where even if it went that way, I know which side I'll be on, and it will not be on the side of authoritarianism.
Can I jump in for a moment,
It just won't. Yeah.
I think that there's the possibility that all of this is very depressing, and I think what we all need to keep in mind is that the left, like you've said many a times, Nick, did not win this battle because they started it yesterday. They started it 50, 60 years ago. And there is joy to be had in investing in one's family, and investing in one's future, and being part of a community at a church and serving others. And I think that one of the biggest things that we can do and understand is that, oftentimes we look to politicians like Donald Trump and these people, and we hope that they, on our behalf, can make huge strides in the right direction for us. But the Leviathan is strong. And, I think you're right, Christian, about Trump, only being able to achieve so much during that time frame. And at the same time having to play the extensive game that he did as to be a politician. But there's joy to be had in the small things. There's joy to be had in your own family. There's joy to be had in your own children, and I will hopefully have children at some point in the near future. And that's a good thing, and that's okay.
I just, look, there's a part of me that kind of cracks up.
Please explain why I'm wrong. I'm looking for proof that I'm wrong, because here's the thing, deep down inside, I feel like you think I'm right, because when I brought up, when was the last time our wing of the party won anything? Yeah. We're losing out. We did not replace, Donald Trump is the punishment the establishment wing of the Republican Party deserves for compromising and surrendering to the left on everything over and over again. What the Republican Party stands for today is what the Democratic Party and the progressives were pushing for 20 years ago. And it has been like that for my entire lifetime. And did we decide to replace George Bush and Mitt Romney with Rand Paul and Thomas Massey? No, we didn't. We replaced him with Donald Trump. And I understand why. I didn't like Trump in 2016. I didn't vote for him in the primaries, but I totally understand why he won. I completely understand why he won. And I understand why the future is going to be more like him and less like Ron Paul and Rand Paul. Not, by the way, not that I think Donald Trump is actually a fascist dictatorship, despite what the left says. I don't think he is. But explain the flaw in that thought process that I have here, because we both are very active in politics.
No, look. Here's the thing I would tell you. I'm not saying that the potential conclusion that you laid out couldn't happen. I'm saying it doesn't have to. But the problem is that when you take a purely fatalistic view of the world, and every time I say this, I get accused of, well, you just don't understand how it is. Okay, I'm not suggesting I do. I got married at 19. I'm very grateful for that. And I got married in 1999, right? So it was a little while ago, and I understand that things have changed. Here's what I can tell you. I know how I've raised my son and my daughters, and I know they don't buy into this crap. So it's possible. I also know this isn't the worst time in human history. I don't know how long it's going to take. I just know where I'm going to stand when I'm called to fight. That's it.
Yeah.
Like the thing that I go back to, somebody asked me before, like, why do you, because believe me, if you don't think there aren't plenty of days during the week where I'm like, why am I still in elected office?
I know. I keep having to fight to convince
and it's not because I don't think the job's important or whatnot, but this is not my life dream. My life's dream was never to be in elected office. I think it's important to fight this battle within these areas, and I'm willing to do it. But somebody keep asking me, like, why do you defeat after defeat after defeat? And it's been a rough time in Virginia. We had a pretty good election cycle 2 years ago, but it's been kind of rough. Why do you keep doing it? I'm like, I am not promised victory in this lifetime. I'm just not. And I've accepted that. Right? What I'm called to be is obedient to my purpose. That's what I'm called to be. I'm called to be obedient in purpose in this life. Right? And so my hope is that I will constantly live my life in such a way to where I am more concerned about what God says when I arrive than what man says when I leave.
It's essential to understand that the war on David is based upon the Druids' establishment religion as a government-established religion. It is the enforcement and disillusionment of all laws and orders and societies in the centrally planned economy, in the centrally planned society, crafted for the purpose of the state-established religion. At which point, the function of the Confederacy in its various insurrections is functionally based on the Whig system overthrowing the normalization of the political parties in its various abuses against the general public, which, having been dissolved in name only, has systematically formed these various injuries in the engagement and overthrow of the long-standing plans from history by the sorcerers and magicians of various kinds who have been planning the history, at which point their forming of the engineered forces guarantees generic outlines for the implementation of how history is to turn out, at which point you have a general black market of extra law functions which generates the criminal offenses and social engineering, such as the political war on alcohol and other prohibitions, which ended up in the centralizing power of the government having exclusive control over it, at which point you have the specific strategy laid out, viewable in the study of the buffalo being controlled by the United States government, from the general outlay of it being in the Indians' control, and then it was centralized into the buffalo being restrained into Yellowstone. And the systems engaged in the mass killing of the buffalo has actively encouraged the position of false opposition in order to corner the market, at which point the enemies having been removed neutralizes the purpose of the product, which allows for the enforcement and normalization of the product, at which point the product being used the entire time is only subversive in the propaganda as far as it is useful to the militant activities of the Druids engaging in the enforcement. At which point you have the various distractions on these systems in the long-term study of history before the fact, as they plan out how history is to work, which is not really an interesting or difficult thing to understand, as that is generically the function of governments in the normalization of crafting how things are supposed to work. You basically have most of the structure together. You just need the type of people who want to be in government at the higher level for the sake of power to understand that the behind closed door rooms has the actual settlements of the long-term structure on how the world is to be engineered. At which point, these larger structures around the world, these globalist structures around the world, need to be taken for granted as what they are. At which point you have these systems which has included the Confederacy forming the Nazi Party in Germany, funded by the United States, emptying its Wall Street accounts in order to fund it under the conditions intended to be violated for the Nazi Party inside the FBI and others who sought the overthrow of the United States, which was only mildly opposed by the military, which then ingested into its own white nationalist agendas in order to reproduce the position, generating the judge's position and the legislator's position of the unitary executive theory, which is Nazism, which is fascist insurrections, such as the enforcement of the Twitter files, which is the government-established economic businesses, at which point the government agenda of influencing the social and political outcomes is generated not as government but as a private entity working for the government, which is fascism. At which point you have the engagement of actively barring through the communism any non-compliance. You have the carrot and you have the stick of benefiting by the cash payouts and promotions, and you have the stick, which is the active punishments and retaliations and obstructions of contracts, etc., which actively uses the black market to have the other competitors pay for the oppositional forces by the government in the subversion of the competitors, normalizing the fascist position of the highest power wizards against each other under their insurrectionist mechanisms. At which point the obstruction of these systems being fundamentally based on horoscopes, such as, but it's not limited to, the Reagan's use of horoscopes for government policies, which was actively promoted by Mrs. Reagan, actively used these influences and was socially engineered into positions of power for the specific purpose of being able to use those mechanisms to overthrow the system, allowing them the engagement of projecting the future American powers in its stability and competence for the United States, which is a subversion of the Nazis' insurrection. So the subversion of the subversion means the parasite needs to attack anything that will attack the parasite. The foreign entity of the parasite, such as the Nazis from the Confederacy, being revoked under the natural causes, creates the counter-immune system, which actively opposes it. At which point you have the William Barr subversions, through voter fraud and other secret terrorisms by illegal extra law or extra to law or not law in the engagement in the specifically prohibited activities from their normalized procedures, at which point you have the social engineered injuries such as the systematic demasculation of the general public, which includes the demasculation of police forces and military for Nazism, which is an effeminate structure, which generates the position of their normalization in subordination to the Druid wizards, allowing for the mechanism of the KKK to exponentially infect the system with white nationalism, at which point the systematic racism of those obstructions managed by the black market actively exchanges on the criminal corruption mechanism. Trump said that the system is corrupt, and he knows because he uses it. It was an honest acknowledgement of a real thing that is legitimately enforced currently. The black market by the government is an actively traded resource, and it is fundamentally essential in their mafia-styled absorption of the criminal element into the government as a Confederate overthrow by espionage insurrection, systematically engaged in voter fraud, blocking the American essential elected members of the government, specifically to stop them from stopping the progress of the insurrection. At which point you have the systematic policies justifying the restraints of law and the excesses of violence by the insurrectionists in order to normalize the pre-crafted history by the insurrection. And these criminal changes having to be changed back were acknowledged by those participating in their various interest and dedication to the Druid insurrectionists, seeking the fighting retreat position. The old saying that it's the 20-80 standard, that 20% of the people do 80% of the work and 80% of the people do 20% of the work, is generally acknowledged as the 80% engaged in the fighting retreat tactic, which allows them to engage in the functional settling of the system, so that those that they've conducted their criminal insurrectionist offenses against would not be able to have certain advantages, finalizing the advantages of having created the black market's criminal permit structure, normalizing permanent damages according to those fighting retreats for their various interests as sorcerers against God and country. Now, these systems, having targeted the high priority targets, systematically changes the substantive results at every level, at which point the false position of protecting the order is actually protecting the anti-order, because of the refusal to investigate in good faith of the actual material substances of the offenses, preventing a legitimate due process from occurring by the obstruction of government and the obstruction of the courts from engaging in these systems, at which point those forces loyal to the United States, being obstructed, cannot conduct those things and are the infection and not the order. The mechanism requires us to engage in the full correction back to the original estimates. Now, these systems have proven by their arrangements our ability to engage in the real market where masculinity isn't suppressed, which systematically changes the numbers from their artificially created fake elite. And their artificially created fake elite generates a saturation of the market, reducing the value of the service, as the majority of them are engaged in mass sacrifice at the altar of the objective of the social engineers, which includes the position on masculinity, which is exponentially reduced by these criminal injuries, by the fake retaliations, which systematically engage in the permanent suppression of the male population into the anti-male position for the social engineers' purposes of the mass production of the beta culture, which actively, as the ordinary men, engages in the position of reinforcing the super predators, which engaged in their criminal exchanges on the black market, such as the rape culture, which is generating the position of their false retaliations as a product, similar to how I've referred to previously about the buffalo purpose, generates the false retaliations and the market stabilizes. So their engagement in the false retaliations for their various interests generates the position of the stabilizing market, which funds the violation happening in reality exponentially more by virtue of it having stabilized as a structure, and the faculties generating the factory, making the product, distributing to the resales, etc., stabilizes the crime as an ordinary traded market, generating the permanent damages against the customer who is buying it in order to solve the problem which they are themselves responsible for creating. Now, you have to understand that these types of systems require active security structures in order to dissolve it after the investigation of the obstructed information, such as the FBI's active position of not confessing to having run investigations while conducting these malicious operations in order to stop the subversion of the operation from occurring, which actively obstructs evidence from the courts, allowing for them to inform the public of crafted narratives with obstructed evidence for Fruit of the Poison Tree, substantively changing the results of what it looks like for alternative votes, at which point you have false verdicts by the social engineering structure, requiring the investigation and due diligence of that information, and for it to be created in a good faith due process, analyzing for the reporting to the general public. So those who have engaged in the criminal subversions through the terror factory, which does not have the intent on stopping the terrorism, who has the intent for the social engineering to engage in the terrorism itself by an excess of false non-controlled function. So they automate the thing and then they let it happen. Generates the position of phantom cells with the investment, which allows for the automating of the factory structure to generate the criminal damages as long as the triggers are all in place, allowing them to engage in the criminal activities by no contact with the phantom cell. Similar to the records version of how they arranged for 9/11, which they would have had to have dissolved if DAIVID had not been restrained, because DAIVID not being restrained stops 9/11, which exponentially increases how important he is in the national security protocols, as he is preferred by the United States soldiers without the restraints, at which point they would have to oppose their automation in the phantom cells by the white nationalist insurrectionists to have stopped 9/11 in order to stop DAIVID from stopping 9/11, in order to stop DAIVID's exponential rise and reputation as their clear and obvious superior. Now, the investigation of these subjects requires the War on DAIVID POW missing in action mechanisms, such as with YouTube, to have engaged in the original companies and the disillusionment of those phantom cells, which requires the triggers, which would historically be the revenge X's. The obstructed history would have had romantic exchanges, and those exchanges having short-term effects would have those X's projected wanting revenge to have had the opportunity to have won the breakup by the use of the terrorism and the defamation mechanism from the criminal racket, generates the obligation for us to engage in the disillusionment of the trigger, which is them getting their revenge. So they have to report on it in order to remove the trigger by the murder hobos from the phantom cells, at which point their ability to have engaged in those reports stops the in-practice murder hobo mechanism, which is in a fighting retreat strategy by the majority of those using the brokerage of the exchange for the crimes on the black market, which requires us to engage in the subversion of the difficulty in that situation, because it requires the exponential action of the government, which is specifically not cooperating, and thus you have the prolonged state of the threat by the terrorist insurrections of the arbitrary murder hobo damages, at which point those systems create the oxymoron, at which point the self-contradictory system on the law being enforced is the objective in their strategies in the subversion of law from its ability to be enforced. Without the protection of rights, you have the success of the insurrectionists in their military campaign as an unprofessional military force, which exponentially increasing its collateral damage effects engages as an extortionary rackets in order to engage in general thefts and damages and exchanges against the public until it has corrupted the society into its internal collapse, into this druid structure, which under the feudalist arrangements allows for fiefdoms in the minor kingdoms of each county and jurisdictions, etc., which are subordinate exclusively to the druids. Now, you might be subject to your local leaders, but you're ultimately subject to the druids, which allows for the second federal government, which is the state-established religion of the druids, which is the criminal insurrectionist threats and criminal intentions as an accessory before the fact, during the fact, and after the fact. Their contempt for the troops is shown in the vets.